Rohit Joshi, CEO of Brightsquid. And so we talked in the first episode a lot about philosophy and leadership. And now we really want to dive into some of the nitty gritty topics here. So Rohit, tell us about Brightsquid. You know, in one sentence, what do you do?
We're a HIPAA compliant messaging, collaboration, and workflow company that's meant for small healthcare practices like the dentist office.
That's actually a very good elevator speech.
And it was
elevator
pitch.
It was one sentence.
I don't know if there was a comma or a period.
No, there was a clause and there may be a semicolon, but there was one sentence, and we could have been on an elevator with Rohit and learned what Brightsquid does.
We could. I don't know if we know why the company's called Brightsquid.
No, we don't. And
does anyone know that?
Rohit,
you know that?
Do you know that?
Yes. Yeah,
all right.
I do. It has to do with, I started the company with a pediatric radiologist, right? And so he and I are sitting down and looking at what we were going to develop. And part of it was we had this cloud in the middle of the whiteboard, and that was representing the cloud, the internet. And then off the bottom of that was multiple image repositories, practice management systems, and so on. And, you know, if you kind of squint your eyes, your virtual eyes, you'll see there's a body with feet. And, you know, and spidering wasn't going to be the right thing. And octopus, you know, it wasn't going to work. And so it became squid. And then, you know, Brightsquid sort of was a fast follow because we were, you know, has to do more with optimism and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Cool.
Got it. I think that's a good answer. Even if you just made that up, I think it's a good
You know
answer.
what? He didn't, because actually I knew that from years ago when we met. So I can vouch for him.
All right. I'll buy into that.
Yeah, you should buy into
Whether it had 8 tentacles or not,
right,
we don't know. I don't even know if squid has tentacles.
We need to figure out our elevator pitch for the Dental Insiders, but that's a completely different story.
That is. Well, but maybe we could get some professional help.
We
right
could
here.
possibly. So you mentioned in your beautifully crafted one sentence elevator pitch that, you know, a big part of Brightsquid is about HIPAA and HIPAA compliance. And so really, how big a deal is HIPAA compliance?
Sure, it's a very big deal, and really it was part of my interest in joining and starting this company, is trying to bring kind of the framework of HIPAA compliance to a product and to a small practice, which doesn't have a lot of people looking after its infrastructure, its technical infrastructure. You know, the hospitals and large organizations have people who look after it. But how could I package and my team package a product that would allow that same type of compliance for a small practice at a reasonable price? And so it's a great challenge, because I think challenges are made up of lots of constraints, right? And so HIPAA compliance, from my perspective, you know, maybe I'm biased because of the company and because I'm a lawyer, but it's a big deal. At last count, there's over 320,000 patients in the U.S. that were compromised from their dental practices. Like, it's a huge number. And
but from dental practices alone.
In the U.S., exactly.
Wow.
And so the cost for the practice for each one of those is about $200. So that's the cost on the practice. I haven't seen a dental practice exist for longer than 18 months after a breach. So once that breach occurs, not only do you have the fines from non-compliance, but you also have patients that will be very upset and choose to leave your practice, or patients that are suing you because now they believe that their medical data and potentially other personal data is available because the data was lost. And guys, it can be really innocuous, right? In our studies, many of the systems are just from loss or theft. Nobody did anything wrong, right? Other than the fact that they didn't encrypt their hard drives or use a secure medium of communication. But the practices are dead after 18 months. Like, it's a horrible eventuality. I did a webinar, you know, maybe almost a year and a half ago now, with one of the office managers from a dental practice that was breached, and it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking for the practice. It's heartbreaking for that individual because they're getting screamed at every day. One of the first pieces that you have to do in a breach is you have to contact every one of your patients and tell them that their health data, their private data, is at risk. And that's a tough call to make. And she was the one having to make it. She was the one writing the letters and hearing. She left after 5 months. She just couldn't handle it.
It's a tough call to make once, but she had to make it 1,000 times.
Right, over and over.
Right. Yeah, and you get those calls. She said even 4 or 5 months after, she was still getting screamed at because people care about their information.
Sure.
And I know that, you know, guys, I mean, the dentists that I've spoken to and said, well, listen, it's not that bad. It's not that big a deal. What does someone care about their crown anyways? You know, or how private is that information? Well, it's not really about the crown. It's about the fact they're diabetic or they've got a heart condition and they're on medication. That as soon as your data has been breached, you look at your medical record and there's a lot of information in there. And that's the way the law looks at it.
Right. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you're the expert here, but I'm pretty sure is the HIPAA fine like $50,000 per incident up to $1.5 million? Is that right? So
Yeah.
How many practices, let's say last year, so we're at the beginning of 2016.
Sure.
In 2015, how many practices is it audited? Is that the right term? How does someone get caught? How's that?
Yeah.
Well, there's two methods that seem to be the most common. The first and most common method is the fact that no HIPAA police showed up at anybody's door. So the most common method is that someone has had their laptop lost, or someone broke into a practice and stole the computers. That's the first and biggest cause of HIPAA breaches. And once someone has breached that, there's an obligation for the practice to report. So it's not someone knocking on the door and saying, hey, it's time for your audit. It's not that at all. It's normal and everyday things that people have done. Portable factor. And as far as audit goes, you know, I think it's rare for dental practices. What I have seen over the past 3 years is there are audits, but they're for large dental insurance companies, or they're for very large corporates that are the targets, right? I think there's been one lab that's been audited. And so these are the large corporates that are big targets, glaring targets. But that's not really what people should be concerned about. It really is about loss, theft, and very normal things that occur. You know, the loss of the cell phone, you know, loss of that in an airport, and you happen to be getting all sorts of email that was patient specific.
Right.
Well, that's a breach. And now the cascade of events occurs.
So you said there were 320,000 breaches last year
In the U.S.
320,000 patients that have been involved in a breach.
last year.
No, the past 4 years, actually.
4 years. Okay. All right.
In the U.S.
In the U.S. And how many practices have been affected by that?
Now, yeah, of course. I think I'd have to check my numbers, but it was somewhere in the order of 38 or 40, somewhere in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Again, not a big number,
Right.
but devastating consequence. It's one of those risk discussions, right? Like it's how much risk do you want to take? Because if it happens, you're out of business. Like
You're dead.
That's the consequence.
Yeah. Crazy. Oh, do dentists care? What's the, what? It's. I'm not a dentist, right? But I would care. I'd care. Do you know why I would care? I wouldn't care because of the fine. I think I'd care because it's the right thing to do. And I think as a practitioner, I would think you as my patient expect it. So I would just deliver it. It's kind of like filtering the water. I wouldn't serve unfiltered water. I wouldn't, have lead in the paint on the walls. I wouldn't do things that I thought were wrong.
Right. It's
not right.
It's the right thing to do. This is sensitive data. You've got all this information about health, about identity. Of course you would protect it. regardless of regulations. So
why aren't they doing it?
Yeah.
Why aren't more dentists doing it?
Sure. That's a great question. So I've got a couple of theories on it. I think the first is really about education. I would say that when I spoke to dentists 5 years ago, people weren't sure if they were covered by HIPAA because they really thought that this was the domain of doctors and hospitals. And, as a small practice, not covered. Well, I think the education part of that is, oh, yes, it's covered. and I think there's a growing understanding that that's the case. Specific to some of our products, there are things that are occurring like sending emails, which are also breaches of HIPAA because it's not a secure method. And from that perspective, it's just more education. Because I'm sending it from my address, it's going to your address. It feels like it should be secure. But the fact is, in between you and I, there's lots of middlemen servers where someone can be reading all of the information going between. And so from that perspective, I think that the biggest communication method between a dental practice and the patient is probably email. And what I've found is as soon as I tell the dentist that what they're using now isn't compliant, Matthew, exactly what you're saying, it feels like an obligation to become compliant. So there's quite a bit of education, really, I think that captures it. The one other piece that I would say is from the real basics perspective, it's not hard to do. And I don't think that's understood either. It seems like, I think there's this large billboard that says HIPAA, which feels like it could be so consuming for a practice that it's going to take me off my game if I'm a dentist. It's not that way. And I think that there's very easy and light ways to get into it, which will protect your patients, protect the dentist and the dental practice for not a big effort.
So you mentioned earlier, we were talking a little bit about some of these breaches, and you mentioned one dental lab. One area that's confusing for me when I look at HIPAA is, and it's a gray area, is, okay, what is a dental laboratory's responsibility? How does this impact them? Does this impact them?
Sure. So I think, broadly speaking, when any company has private or protected health information, and the acronym is PHI, whenever they're holding that information, they have an obligation to store it in a secure way. So by extension, what happens is, if I've got a dentist's office and they're using a lab, they ought to have an agreement in place with that lab that says, I'm sharing my data with you, which is okay for me to do, but I need to make sure that you are recognizing the importance of the privacy. Now, I've seen a very few labs that have, sort of numbering systems and ways of anonymizing the information. So they never actually know the patient's name or address. They don't know anything about the patient. And what they see is, a small tooth. In that case, there's really no protected health information because you couldn't identify the individual from that little artifact. But I would say that that's in very, very few situations. Much more common is patient name, what they need done, and it's really a prescription. And in some cases, in very high functioning labs, I've heard them have a number of photos. So here's the photos of the individual. That's pretty clearly protected health information because you can identify so I think there's a whole range of things. The purely unidentifiable ones are very, very rare in my experience. And really what we're talking about is how much information, not if there's information. But that's held by the patient in practice.
So is the cloud a friend or the enemy or neither? And when it comes to data encryption and protecting patient to the PHI?
Sure. And so the way I looked at it, and this goes kind of back to some of the philosophy that we started talking about, was I felt that was our obligation. And so for HIPAA requirements, it's not just data encryption, it's also how often do you back the data up? How is it accessible in an emergency? How do you test your backups? How do you test your internal process to make sure that the encryption keys get changed and altered every now and then. How do you audit and log all of that information? So we've got all of this criteria, which is a big list for a company like ours. And so our promise to the dental office was, we want to do all of that for you. And the only way we can do that for you is through the cloud. And so we're as rigorous as we can be, and we've been third-party certified by people whose only job is to say, are you HIPAA compliant? And that's only possible because of, of the cloud. So I think I'm a big believer in the cloud. I know that from a practice perspective, not all the dental practices are certainly quite far away from that thinking. But from my perspective, if we can guarantee all of those elements are there, it's a big burden off of the practice to engage us.
I think that cloud definitely has a silver lining. Switching gears here a little bit, you talked earlier that a few years ago, dentists, really weren't concerned, maybe because they didn't even know that it applied to them.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden we're talking about, cloud storage and secure email and, and even, on, digital impression, file sharing and all that kind of stuff. Is technology in dentistry, and we know technology moves fast, is technology in dentistry moving too fast for dentists to keep up?
That's a great question. And, I'm lucky. I get to travel to, around the world looking at different technologies and seeing how we can integrate and how we can work with them. I think that the basics of the technology are not changing as fast as it appears that they are. And so I'd say there's lots of noise with technology, that there's all sorts of new gadgets and new things to look at. New attempts to do the same things better. But
Very good.
so I think I lost you there for a minute.
Yep, we're back.
Great. And so I think while there's a lot of noise about the technology, I end up seeing very little of it actually in practice. Workload, improving workflow, improving communication. A lot of it, to be honest, can be quite gimmicky. And it's a great inventor who's had a great idea, who wants to bring it to market. But I find that more distracting than valuable.
Yeah,
very interesting take.
Yeah, it is, and I don't necessarily disagree with it. I mean, this is a product. The dental industry, we kind of come from the
product
side, and I think we kind of agree with it. It's just kind of built that way. But dentistry is really just about care.
Care,
right?
and relationships.
The products help. The relationships and the care are so important. But I'm certain we could give a good clinician a handpiece that's 15 years old, and they could do the job.
They could probably do a good crown prep.
And maybe with composites and some materials, it's a little different. But there's some technology there. But there's a lot of things there. It does move fast, and that's just kind of it's the way it goes.
Seems like there's a lot of concentration on new bells and whistles, and not a lot of concentration on really,
core
game-changing changes to workflow and procedures.
Right. Yeah.
At least that's my take.
So we got to wrap up, but I have a couple quick questions. So how does this is not a trick question, but I think it's a rhetorical question. How does a dental practice know if they're HIPAA compliant?
They'll know pretty quickly, because one of the things that you do as you're going through, the first step is that you've got a privacy officer and someone who's responsible to make sure that you go through the process. So if you haven't assigned someone, you're not.
Okay. And is it?
I think it's simple.
Does software? So you're a third party that kind of bolts into my practice and my software. But is there software that exists currently, practice management software, that is HIPAA compliant? So maybe I am, and I just don't know it.
No, if you don't know it, you won't be. Because there are even with things that are sitting in your office, if you don't have proper backup procedures, and if you've never talked to people about, even in the physical side of it, if you have a monitor that's facing your waiting room rather than facing away from the waiting room, that's problem is if there's access to people's information that shouldn't be there, people who shouldn't have access don't have access. There's probably some issues there. So you kind of almost have to walk through your practice and say, is there any place here where people could have access to information they shouldn't?
Right.
So it really boils down to a combination of best practices, knowledge, and technology.
It sounds like a three-legged squid.
It sounds like
Squid don't have legs.
a three-tentacled. It sounds like might be another episode of the Dental Insider.
Episode 3.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, I think that does wrap up another episode of the Dental Insiders, and we'd like to thank our guest, Rohit Joshi, for joining us. Thanks, Rohit. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks. And, I'm here all day, so call me.
Awesome. And thank you, our lovely audience, for spending some time with us. Please join us next time. Tell your friends and colleagues about the Dental Insiders. Cheers.
Right. Thanks, guys.